Hey guys, I'm Tom. Today we're going to be looking at a few production techniques that I learned, discovered, and furthermore used in my most previous project, the Castlevania sound replacement. So let's get straight into it. The first production technique that I used a lot during this project, and I discovered a lot about through research, was layering. Take a look at this short video that explains a really nice concept that I used a lot in my project.
Combine content with complementary frequencies like the dolphin and the walrus. Look for sounds to fill the parts of the spectrum that you're missing. This approach makes things sound full-bodied and powerful.
So here's an explanation of using sounds that complemented each other in the frequency spectrum. It was really an eye-opener to me, as before I'd been kind of just putting sounds together that were kind of the same and expecting it to get fuller, but I learned that that's kind of the completely wrong process and you should be going for the opposite. So in this project, I used quite a bit of this production technique. For example, we're going to be looking at this sword swing that I have here. I'll let you have a listen of it in its full. So firstly, in our layering, we have the woof jump just before. That kind of gives weight to the action even before the main action has happened. But that preemptive sound that comes right before it gives you that kind of anticipation for the big clash that's about to happen. Next, we have these high frequency layers. We have that. That's more of a mid-range kind of sound that I got there. I think this one is too, giving us that mid frequencies and a little bit of the highs. And that kind of gives us that gritty kind of tone within the sound. And that's our real high end. That's kind of the sound that makes this whole sound feel like it's from anime and not from anything else, just because it's so crisp and clear at the top, and it's really like cliche and over dramatic, and I love it. And then next, we have that stretched out utensils hitting each other. Kind of gives it that impact and low end a bit, just supports it that tiny little bit. And then finally, we have another scrape that goes throughout the whole sound, kind of just merging it all together. So again, all together. And I just want to give you a sample of it without this top end as well, because just this one little layer is what differentiates it from being just like a regular sound to an anime sound. And I really love it. So here it is with it, and here it is without it. It's totally different. It becomes so anime, that one layer on the top of it. So the next production technique I want to quickly go over is sequencing. And we're actually going to use the very next sound in my project, which is this nice whip sound. Sequencing is really underappreciated. In a lot of things I looked up online, they would keep going over and over on the layering, but they never talk about the sequencing they were doing, how they were arranging their sounds over the time of the visual. Like, it wasn't even necessary to have these first sounds. We could have just had that. But sequencing them beforehand, even the action has started, just gives it that intensity and just creates a lot more interest in the sound. And just emphasizing those air movements and with the whip, where in real life there wouldn't even be any sound happening there, just creates so much more interest. And how it just goes from that sound to that sound to that sound and becomes kind of this rhythm after you hear it a lot. Really gives it that definition. It's just great. I love it. It's nice. So next I want to go over the production technique utilizing real sounds with fake sounds. I wanted to start this out with this clip I have from YouTube of them explaining why it's important. It's actually from the same video. Take a look.
Even if the sound doesn't exist in the real world, try creating it with things that do.
When you use sounds gathered in the outside world, the real world, and you bring them into a science fiction film, you get the credibility of those sounds to sell to the audience the reality of what's really just a very fantastic world.
So in my own words, what he's saying is having synthetic sounds with real sounds will give you that sense of realism, but also push it to its boundaries. Because without it, it'll just feel like it's not human, it's not from this world, and therefore the listener will get kind of pulled out of that world as soon as they notice that, and they won't be immersed anymore, and it'll be all because of the audio. So putting in real sounds with these augmented kind of sounds that we put in there and these synthy kind of sounds as well is what kind of sells to the listener that this sound is real. And it's why people don't question some sounds as to where they came from and why they sound like they do, because they've heard them before, they just don't know it. And as an example in my project where I use this, I'm going to be taking this big gust of flames that comes from this big creature in the opening sequence. Take a look. So firstly, we used these two synth layers. The first one being a low one, giving that low depths, and then the highs. Also using that layering technique that I mentioned before. This, along with these sounds, is what really sells it. With these fire sounds, I thought, how am I going to make these sounds? And so I did a bit of research, and I found big ends of the spectrums. The first is like this. And yes, that's a Zoom recorder right next to the flames, right there. And so I thought, that's really cool. And that's kind of where I came in, as I'll mention later on, with the aerosol can and a lighter and making a flamethrower and recording that. And on the other opposite spectrum, we have synths that are being used, utilizing LFOs and envelopes and randomization to really sell the essence of just a natural fire. So let's go through the real sounds. Firstly, we have this aerosol fire, which is, yes, me using an aerosol can and a lighter and creating a flamethrower. Now, it's funny because I didn't actually use this with flames, but I modulated it around to become more of the voice of the monster. Take a listen. It just proves that like some sounds you can produce and then they actually end up being totally different to what you thought they would be. Really useful to something that you didn't think they would be. Next, the real sound we have is the tape brush. You know those big balls of old-fashioned tape? They make really good fire sounds, like really good. If we actually go over to this video that I'm going to show you later, you can see it in the corner there. Just a nice big pile of tape. And just moving it around gives really nice authentic sounds, especially for fire. It's commonly known that fire is made a lot with paper and crunching that up, and the tape is just like more crunchy than paper and just gives it so much movement. In my example, you'll hear in the second part, it sounds like nothing on its own. Sounds like nothing, but with everything else, it just gives it that sense of movement. You can hear it right at the top. Just pierces through and gives that movement as if it's just coming right over you. And we have this. That is me just breathing in, and I've just time stretched it. As you can see, it's called Very Very. So I've stretched it and then stretched it again. And then that's just creating that really low, depthy kind of sound that comes with him breathing in for the fire and then just letting it rip. And along with these sounds, we also have fire crackling. And what I've done, I've just gotten this original one, time stretched it here, and time stretched it even more down there. So you hear the first one. I pan that right. That's in the center. And I pan that left. So together, kind of just gives that tiny little bit over the top that just sells you the firing. You can hear it the tiniest bit over the top. This production technique of using these synthetic sounds along with real sounds is really what makes this sound really convincing and come together quite well. And I really like that I took this approach of using synth sounds, because I don't have much experience with it. Although quite basic, was actually a lot of fun. So the next production technique we have is making our sounds appropriate for the context. So how do you do that, and what does that actually mean? Well, to me, that means making the sound drive the narrative and bring the audience into the environment. Let me tell you about what I mean. For this example, I'm going to be using these wolf screams. So in this context, these are the bad guys. They look like giant monsters. They've got the red evil eyes, and they are about to come on and approaching our protagonist. And so in this context, I wanted them to sound evil and menacing and really powerful. And I just wanted them to overall just feel really scary. Our main protagonist should be scared. And so for this, I used just regular human roars. That's just a human voice right there for you. And then so you time stretch that, put it in the environment with the reverb, and then give it that menacing kind of feel, adding the lows and taking out the highs. And you get that really low depthy kind of roar, along with the second one as well. I've already gone up here and had to render the effects that I've put on it, but you can generally hear that it's the same process of me stretching it out and EQing it, and then adding more reverb to put it in the space, and then ending out like that. I think this one was my own voice at home. I had a bit of a different recording technique, standing further away from my computer and literally screaming it and then putting all these effects on it and then turning out like that. Wherefore this one was up close and just like a soft little roar from one of Justin's friends. And this third one, same thing as the first one. It's just a regular human roar with all these effects. Hallie is supporting the narrative and driving the kind of environment that it's in. All these reverbs that I've been discussing are putting it into the space. These reverbs have got a little 1.7 second delay and only a tiny bit of wet in them. This is just the distance of screams from the viewer, so that the screams are not right in between your ears. Take a listen without the reverbs. They sound right there in your face. I kind of didn't want that. I wanted them to seem further away like they are to our protagonist. They're a bit away right now. So you put that on. And they just seem that bit more distant away. With this, I've also got them all on a bus down to these woof screams where the reverb comes up with it, so you hear it as they approach him as well. And then I've got it again for the scream I have here as well. And then secondly, making them sound really evil and dark is this use of EQs where I add the low ends, really boost them, and then also the use of time stretching and that therefore pitching them down and stretching them out and making them feel full-bodied and really quite strong. Supporting the narrative that they are the evil people in this scenario and that they are a threat to be reckoned with. It's also relevant in this situation to know that it's common to just evoke this kind of emotion and narrative with English. But in this context, you can't. The wolves don't speak English. Let me just show you this video that explains kind of how sound is perceived in this kind of context and how we get emotion from more of the tone of the voice than what's actually being said.
But we understand him. That's because things like inflection and pitch don't necessarily need words paired with them to be effective. The reason he sounds so human is because of his tone. So it might not be surprising to you that Bastion is actually voiced by a real person.
So then he was talking about a character within a game. But this point that vocals on a track aren't quite determined by what they're saying, but more by the inflections and performance of the audio instead. So the next production technique I have is to deceive your audience. I've kind of already mentioned this a little bit, but I'm going to go into more detail. And for this, we're going to go back to our sword swings. When creating Foley, we don't record the sounds that are shown on screen. I don't have massive swords hanging around that I can bang together to make these big swords. So what do? We deceive our audience. We create sounds that aren't the sounds that are on the picture, but sound as though they would fit the picture. As Marshall McGee says in one of his videos on layering, our minds are really good at putting sound with picture. So we deceive our audience by using sounds that are different to what's being shown. Like in this sound, we have literally a pot being hit for this massive collision of swords and this hit of a teacup and the grating of metal together, which is kind of relevant. But all these sounds put together creates the illusion and that kind of just like kind of its own melody, kind of how it just goes just really is nice. That it's something new. And then it's this nice big sword swing as seen here. As recording wise, as to how I went about this, I have this video that we mentioned before that has me demonstrating the sword swings. This specific sound here was used later in the trailer where the main protagonist sheaths his sword. So here I'm using this steel pole and this tiny little, what looks like came off a doorknob, little metal thing. And then I'm holding it like a triangle with this plastic thing, as there was a tiny convenient little hole at the top. And then we got this sound. Really nice stuff. And so by using just a regular pole, we managed to get a really convincing sword swing that no one ever would have noticed was actually just a regular metal pole. Finally, I have one last tip for you that's from myself, and you can do research into it as well. I have a little bit, but is to organize your session. When I came to do this video and come back to this, my session was terrible. I'll just tell you that. Absolutely terrible. It's still all right now. I've kind of just organized it so it goes diagonally down my sounds. But if I move this out of the way, there's still a few sounds floating around that I'd have to get to. Let me show you how bad my previous session was. And yep, already problems, more problems. And as we see here, my sounds are everywhere, dude. At the end of the project, I was spending half my time trying to find the sounds that I wanted to edit. So as we see with the flame sound we had before, half the sounds are here, but then we also have half of our sounds down here. You can see that a lot of the sounds, you can see that like these sounds are supposed to be in sync with stuff down here, and it's just generally just all over the place. And I also have extra clips all over the place. All these long ones aren't needed. They were just stuff that I was holding, and it was just a really unorganized mess. I was the kind of person to ignore all the warnings that people were giving me about organization, and this is what ended up happening. And I've learned my lesson, because I didn't never think this project was going to get to over 100 tracks. Because I think this project was about 110 tracks, which was way more than I thought it would be. And I've also found out that with my workflow, I like to have just one sound to one audio track, or at least just a few sounds that are within a few seconds. So as you can see here with this track down here, you're reusing the